Fuzzy Mud by Louis Sachar, Chapter 15, Down in the Dungeon. There was still no sign of Chad when Marshall walked into his classroom and took his seat. His relief quickly turned to anxiety, however. He turned his head toward the door every single time he heard it open. He knew Chad would come waltzing in at any moment, telling everyone about what had happened in the woods and about how Marshall had needed a little fifth-grade girl to protect him. Even after class started and Chad still hadn't shown, Marshall's anxiety only grew worse. He tapped his foot throughout morning announcements. In a way, he hoped Chad would hurry up and get there. Let him do what he was going to do, say what he was going to say, and get it over with. The worst part was the waiting. When first period ended, Marshall moved very cautiously through the hall, certain that Chad was waiting behind every corner. He made it safely to algebra, and when he saw that Chad's desk was empty, he finally was able to relax, but just a little bit. Math had always been Marshall's best subject, and without Chad's eyes burning a hole through the back of his head, he was able to concentrate for the first time in weeks. Mr. Brandt put a pair of simultaneous equations on the whiteboard. Marshall mentally went through the necessary steps to solve them, just as his teacher worked them through for the class. Mr. Brandt put up 2 more equations. Anyone want to try? Chad or no Chad? Marshall still didn't dare raise his hand. Perhaps Mr. Brandt had caught something in Marshall's expression, an alertness in his eyes. "Marshall," he said, "you want to give it a go?" Marshall flinched at the mention of his name, then slowly rose. As he made his way to the front of the room, he heard none of the usual snide whispers, no legs stuck out trying to trip him. He took the marker from Mr. Brandt, studied the 2 equations for a moment, and then wrote a new equation, combining elements from the other 2. He felt his confidence grow as he replaced letters with numbers. Behind him, the door opened. It couldn't even have been called a squeak, just an old door rotating on its hinges, but Marshall recognized the sound the moment he heard it. His confidence left him as his legs turned to jelly. He tried to concentrate on the equation in front of him, but now it was all just a confusing jumble of numbers, letters, and mathematical signs. He heard the click-click of hard shoes on the floor. That didn't sound like Chad. He slowly turned. The head mistress, Mrs. Thaxton, was walking purposefully toward the front of the room, a stern and determined look on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Brandt," she said, then turned her back on Marshall in order to face the class. "I'm afraid I have some very disturbing news." Marshall didn't know where he was supposed to go. He didn't want to have to cross in front of Mrs. Thaxton in order to return to his desk. Instead, he slowly edged away from the board toward the side wall. She spoke slowly and deliberately. "One of your classmates, Chad Hilligus, is missing. He hasn't been seen since he left school yesterday afternoon. As far as we know, he never made it home." Mrs. Thaxton took a breath, then continued, "If any of you know anything about where he might have gone or what has happened to him, I need to know immediately." Nobody said a word. As Marshall stood at the side wall, his thoughts were a swirling mass of confusion. He had become paralyzed at the mention of Chad's name. He could hear the pounding of his heart echoing inside his head. "Does anybody remember seeing Chad after school yesterday?" asked Mr. Brandt. "If you saw or heard anything," coaxed Mrs. Thaxton. Marshall knew he ought to say something, but it seemed impossible. Laura Musgrant slowly raised her hand. "Yes, Laura," said Mr. Brandt. "I saw him." "Where?" "On Richmond Road." "Did he say anything to you?" Mrs. Thaxton asked. "No, I was in my mom's car. We just drove past. You asked if we saw him, that's all." Marshall wondered if Laura would have noticed him too, if he had been there. "Did you notice which way he was heading?" asked Mrs. Thaxton. If you leave the school and turn right. I think we drove the other way, so I didn't see him after that." "Did anyone else see or talk to Chad?" asked Mrs. Thaxton. "Either after school or perhaps earlier? Did he say what his plans were for after school?" Cody raised his hand, then quickly lowered it, but not before Mr. Brant noticed. "Do you know something, Cody?" He kind of told me what he was going to do, but I feel weird saying it." "What did he tell you, Cody?" demanded Mrs. Thaxton. "This is not the time to worry about being embarrassed or feeling weird." "Okay, you asked." Cody shrugged. "He said he was going to beat up Marshall." Muffled laughter came from the back corner of the room, but one look from Mrs. Thaxton silenced whoever had laughed. "Sorry, man," Cody said, looking at Marshall. "That's what he said." For the first time, Mrs. Thaxton turned to notice Marshall standing awkwardly against the wall. "Marshall, what do you know about this?" All he could manage was a shrug. It took all his effort just to keep from trembling. "Did you encounter Chad on your way home yesterday?" He shook his head. "Did you know he was looking for you?" "No," he said. "Did you see him at all?" "I just walked home, like always. He wasn't there." Mrs. Thaxton took a long, hard look at him. "Do you know why he wanted to fight you? Did something happen earlier?" He shook his head. "Chad's been picking on Marshall all year," said Andy, "for no reason." "Marshall never did anything," volunteered Laura. "Chad's just mean." Mrs. Thaxton took another long look at Marshall, then turned her attention back to the rest of the class. "If anybody thinks of anything else, any little thing Chad might have done or said, or something somebody else might have said about Chad, please let Mr. Brant or me know. If you need to talk in private, I will be in my office. Please think hard and don't be afraid to come to me. I will keep anything you tell me strictly confidential." She walked out of the room. Then all eyes fixed on Marshall. He quickly returned to his seat. The equations remained on the whiteboard, unsolved. Chapter 16, Wednesday, November 3rd, 10:15 a.m. Using cotton balls and hydrogen peroxide, Mrs. Latherley cleaned the blood off Timea's hand. "You mustn't scratch it," she admonished. "I didn't," said Timea. "The more you scratch, the worse it will get," said Mrs. Latherley. "It will just cause the rash to spread. Plus, any time you break the skin, there's the possibility of infection." "I didn't scratch it," Timea repeated. She was seated in a plastic chair in an alcove inside the office. The alcove contained the office printer and the coffee maker. The medical supplies were on a shelf next to the printer. Mrs. Latherley spent most days answering phones or working on a computer, but whenever anyone got sick or needed first aid, she was the person to see. "Maybe I rubbed it a little," Timea admitted, "but it doesn't itch. It feels tingly. You know how, like, when your hands are really cold and then you stick them under warm water? The way they get all prickly, that's how it feels." "Uh-huh," Mrs. Latherley said, as she took a first aid box off the shelf, but Timea didn't think she was really listening. She watched Mrs. Latherley unlatch the lid, then take out various tubes, read the labels, and then put them back. Timea really wished Mrs. Latherley would hurry. She still hoped she could get back to class in time to finish her journal entry. In her mind, she imagined Hope, Jason, and Monica taking turns reading their How to Blow Up a Balloon instructions to Miss Filbert. She could see the balloons flying out of the teacher's mouth and jetting in circles around the room while everyone laughed. "It isn't fair," she thought. "Why do I always have to miss out on all the fun stuff?" It seemed to be that way all the time. She'd missed Hope's limousine birthday party because it had been her weekend to be in Philadelphia. And then Katie, her only sort of friend in Philadelphia, had invited her to go horseback riding in the country with her and her family. But that, too, had been for the wrong weekend. Mr. Franks, the assistant headmaster, stepped into the alcove. "Hi, Timea," he greeted her. "You're not sick, are you?" No, just a rash. Good. We don't want to ruin your perfect record. He winked at her. Timea could feel her face get warm, and she tried very hard not to blush. All her friends agreed that Mr. Franks was movie star handsome. Summer swore he had a tattoo on the back of his neck, which was why he always wore a jacket and tie. Summer didn't know what the tattoo was, but it was definitely something inappropriate. If Mrs. Thaxton found out about it, he would be fired. Mr. Franks bent down to pour himself a cup of coffee, and Timea tried to get a peek at his neck. She couldn't see anything. She doubted he really had a tattoo. After all, how could Summer know about it and not Mrs. Thaxton? "Hold out your hand," said Mrs. Latherley. Timea waited for Mr. Franks to leave the alcove. She didn't want him to see her ugly rash. "I tried some of my mother's hand cream," she told Mrs. Latherley. "It didn't work." "This will," Mrs. Latherley assured her. As Mrs. Latherley applied the ointment, Timea read the label on the upside-down tube. Hydrocortisone 1%. She took heart in the words, "maximum strength." "Do you have any pets?" Mrs. Latherley asked. "Cooper, my dog." "Do you think you might be allergic to Cooper?" "No!" she exclaimed. "That would be horrible. Cooper was the best part of going to her dad's. He slept on the same bed with her, and she often woke up with the dog licking her face. Has Cooper had any kind of problems lately with fleas or ticks or mange?" "I hope not," said Timea. Mrs. Latherley looked confused. "Has he or hasn't he?" Timea explained that she saw Cooper only one weekend a month. Mrs. Latherley seemed exasperated. "Timea, I am trying to determine what might have caused your rash. If you haven't been near Cooper, then it obviously didn't come from him." "Sorry," Timea said. She felt stupid. It felt confusing sometimes having two different homes. It was like she had two different lives, two half-lives, and the two added together didn't quite equal a whole life. She felt like she was missing something. Mrs. Latherley wrapped Timea's hand with gauze. "Is there anything else you might have touched recently that you can think of?" she asked. "Maybe some kind of a cleaning product." Timea wondered if she could tell Mrs. Latherley about the strange mud. She didn't want to get Marshall in trouble. Still, she knew it was important to tell the truth to a doctor or nurse, even if Mrs. Latherley was just a part-time school nurse. "Well, there was this fuzzy mud," she admitted. "Have you eaten peanuts or peanut butter?" asked Mrs. Latherley, showing no interest in the mud. Timea's mind remained fixed on the fuzzy mud. It all happened so quickly. But replaying it in her head in slow motion, she could see herself picking up a handful of the tar-like muck. She vaguely recalled that it had felt warm, although she couldn't be certain that she wasn't just embellishing her memory. "Have you recently eaten any peanuts or peanut butter?" Mrs. Latherley asked again. Timea forced herself to focus on the question. "I had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich yesterday," she said. "It might have been the day before." "You may be allergic," said Mrs. Latherley. "Next time you see the doctor, have your mother ask for an allergy test. In the meantime, I wouldn't eat any more peanut butter sandwiches." "My mom makes her own strawberry jam," Timea offered, "out of real strawberries. Maybe I'm allergic to that." "Maybe," said Mrs. Latherley. "She's taking me to the doctor after school." "Good." Mrs. Latherley wrapped each of Timea's fingers separately, then her palm and wrist. "How does that feel?" Timea tried to wriggle her fingers. "Like I'm a mummy," she joked. Mrs. Latherley smiled. "I'd like to give you an allergy pill too, but I need to get your mother's permission. I'll call her at work. Check back with me after lunch." Timea said she would. "And remember, no more scratching." 2 times 1024 is 2048. 2 times 2048 equals 4096.